Okay, let's get started. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Condense the Evidence, Live Critical Appraisal Writing with KSR Evidence, and happy World Evidence-Based Healthcare Day. My name is Willemijn Linden. I am the database manager for KSR Evidence, and I will be your moderator and host today. A little bit about me. I joined Klein and Systematic Reviews, or KSR, in January 2018, and I manage the database day to day, and I am also the main point of contact for KSR Evidence. So here is the outline for today's session. After going over some housekeeping rules, I will introduce our speaker for today, Susan O'Meara, and give a brief overview of the typical guideline development process and how critical appraisals are vital to assess the available evidence. I will show you how our database KSR Evidence handles critical appraisals, and I will put through a fast track request for the critical appraisal we will appraise in this session today. Sue will then write the critical appraisal with you all, and she will cover some well-known pitfalls and difficulties that come with critically appraising a review. We will both be available to answer any questions you might have in the Q&A at the end of the session. Now, before I introduce our speaker and talk a little bit more about critical appraisals and KSR Evidence, I would like to cover just a few housekeeping topics. So first of all, today's webinar is being recorded. We will share a link with you once the event is complete, and we will put it up on the website. We welcome you to revisit this content at any time and share it with your colleagues. So whilst we do have a dedicated Q&A at the end of the session, we welcome your comments and questions throughout. To do so, please just locate the Q&A box. It should be in the toolbar there. And if you think of a question for us at any point, just type it in there, and I will either pose it to our speaker or hold it for the discussion portion at the end of the session. And just to add, our KSR Evidence team is always happy to help with any query you might have. So if you think of something after today's webinar has ended, I know that that always happens to me. I always have a question after something is already over. Just get in touch with us. And finally, the expected duration of this webinar is around an hour for the session itself, with a further 10 to 15 minutes for any questions. Today's speaker is Susan O'Meara. Sue has been involved in the design, conduct, and management of systematic reviews for over 2 decades. She has reviewed the literature in many different topic areas in healthcare, specializing in the management of non-healing skin ulcers, such as diabetic foot ulcers, pressure ulcers, and leg ulcers. In addition to her substantial research expertise, Sue is an experienced teacher and trainer in research methods and evidence-based practice, so she will be perfectly placed to walk through this critical appraisal with you all later. Now, for the purpose of this session, we will be using a made-up guideline of sorts on the topic of glucose monitoring in patients diagnosed with diabetes. Because we only have 1 hour, I will not go over the different stages of a guideline in much detail. However, broadly speaking, the following stages are usually adhered to. So first, the guideline topic is identified and a committee and stakeholders are established. Then the scoping stage commences, in which the rationale for the guideline is set out and the initial draft is sent to stakeholders for feedback. Once the final scope has been published, we enter the development stage. And during this stage, the review questions are finalized, literature searches are performed, evidence reviews are undertaken, and the draft recommendations are produced. It then moves to the consultation and revision stages, where both the stakeholders and committee review and comment on the draft guideline. There is then a period of quality assurance and sign-off before the guideline is being published. Now, the process I have outlined here is based on NICE, but of course there are other guideline providers and details of the process might vary between them. For today's session, we are going to focus on the development stage because KSR Evidence can be really useful in this stage of the process. KSR Evidence provides an advanced search interface for systematic reviews, as well as more than 22,000 critical appraisals. So Let's say that the scope for our guideline on glucose monitoring in patients diagnosed with diabetes has been produced. The scope has been produced, it's been agreed, literature searches have been carried out. We have actually asked our information specialist team here at KSR Evidence to produce a search for our guideline, and they have kindly shared that with us. So please allow me 1 minute while I share my other screen here. Okay, so now we are on KSR Evidence and we are in the advanced search interface. As you can see, the information specialists really put together a nice search for us. It features some Boolean operators as well as adjacency and truncation. Now, of course, you know, this guideline is not real, so keep in mind that the search strategy would be more advanced for an actual guideline. However, this gives a good idea of what the search interface of KSR Evidence is capable of, and also the rough amount of records it has retrieved for our topic. I've run the search already before the start of our session, and here you can see all the systematic reviews and meta-analyses that have been found. And for our guideline, for the purpose of that guideline, you know, these results have been exported in a RIS file, imported into EndNote, screened the titles and abstracts to ensure which ones are relevant. And what's great about KSR Evidence is that our information specialists have already done a lot of the heavy lifting for me and also for our little, you know, made up guideline here, because they have developed highly advanced search strategies that find everything related to systematic reviews. And those results are then screened by those same experienced and qualified information specialists. Every record on KSR Evidence, therefore, has been screened for inclusion. So you know that when you search KSR Evidence, you are really searching the top of the mountain of evidence. So now that the literature search has been performed and we have screened the results for inclusion, the next step in our guideline process would be to review the evidence. And you can see that for actually quite a few of these reviews here, there's a rating next to them of either low or high or unclear risk of bias. And this means that these reviews have already been critically appraised by the KSR Evidence team, saving our guideline even more time because now we do not have to appraise all of these reviews ourselves. Apart from the advanced search interface, another really cool feature of KSR Evidence is that we have put systems in place that allow us to prioritize the appraisal of highly relevant studies. So rather than appraising all systematic reviews, we have implemented a prioritization process where a reviewer screens all newly added systematic reviews and marks them as either priority or not a priority. And the priority records then go on to be critically appraised, which allows KSR Evidence to focus on those systematic reviews that are most likely to be of interest of users. Now, speaking of reviews that are of interest to users, we polled our audience on Twitter, and most of you wanted us to appraise this review right here. And I just opened a different tab, but it's the exact same search. I've just activated some filters. So the results set is now filtered down and I could more easily find the record here that we're going to appraise today. And Sue is going to show you exactly what is involved in the process in just a couple of minutes. But before I hand over, let me show you how a subscriber to KSR Evidence can save a lot of time by requesting a fast track from us. So here I have opened the record and you can see that it includes the bibliographic details as well as the abstract here. And on the side, there is an option for subscribers to request a fast track, which would cost £25. So what this means is that for £25, you can request this review right here to be appraised. And turnaround time depends on a couple of factors, such as availability of the source material. But usually the appraisal will be published in just a couple of days. And you can also request multiple appraisals to be fast-tracked at once, saving you a lot of time when the deadline is tight, because KSR Evidence will appraise these reviews for you at a fraction of the true cost of undertaking an appraisal. Now, I think I've talked quite enough, and I think we are all ready to appraise this review. I am now going to hand over to Sue, but I will remain available in the chat to answer any questions you might have. And Sue, the floor is yours.
Okay, I hope you can all now see a slide that shows the outline of what I'm going to be covering. So first of all, I'm going to just quickly introduce the review and explain the subject matter of the review, just by way of an introduction. And after that, I'm going to move on to the appraisal of the review for the KSR Evidence record. And that'll cover several things. So we look at the basic details of the review, we look at the study selection criteria, we look at results, obviously, and we look at the methodological assessment of the review using the ROBIS tool. And lastly, we come to the bottom line. In other words, what are the main messages coming out of the review? So let's start with just a little bit about the review itself. And this information is just to set the scene for the appraisal that's going to follow. So as Will mentioned, there was a poll on Twitter, and thank you very much to everybody who took part in that, so that this paper had the most votes. So the focus of the paper is the effect of artificial pancreas systems on glycemic control in patients with type 1 diabetes. So this is a systematic review, and it's also a series of meta-analyses. So just to explain a little bit about the population that's relevant here. So it's people with type 1 diabetes. Now the diabetes affects the whole body, but really the most pertinent organ of the body is the pancreas. So the pancreas is an abdominal organ, and it secretes two hormones, insulin and glucagon. And these are key hormones in the metabolism of dietary carbohydrate. And they work together, but in different ways. So insulin helps to stop the blood sugar getting too high, and glucagon helps it not get too low. And in healthy people with a healthy pancreas, the pancreas secretes just the right amounts of each hormone in order to keep the blood glucose in a healthy range. So it regulates the blood glucose levels. In type 1 diabetes, the pancreas produces either no insulin at all or very little insulin. And as insulin is a hormone that's necessary for life, it means that the patient has to have external insulin injections. And the conventional, the traditional approach to this has been multiple daily injections of insulin. And normally the patient would deliver that to themselves. But this can actually be quite challenging, because whilst the healthy pancreas is actually naturally achieves a very fine tuning of the amount of insulin that's required, that's actually really difficult to simulate from external injections, and it can be really tricky to get it just right. And because of that, a frequent complication of type 1 diabetes is a condition called hypoglycemia, which means that the blood sugar has dropped too low. And that can be have unpleasant symptoms. So initially the patient might feel dizzy and weak, may have palpitations and sweating. If it's left unchecked, it can actually become quite serious, with the patient becoming confused or even unconscious. And that will inevitably need medical intervention. And as part of that, it's usually necessary to have glucagon injections to help bring the blood pressure up to a more normal level. So that was all about the natural pancreas. Well, the intervention of interest here is the artificial pancreas. So I'm just going to say a little bit about that. So artificial pancreas systems are multi-component medical devices. And you can see from the diagram here that there are several components. So on the left of this person's abdomen, as you're looking at it, you can see something called a continuous glucose sensor, or continuous glucose monitor. And this is a small device, and part of it is inserted just underneath the skin. And it acts by continuously monitoring the patient's blood glucose. And then further down, but on the right of this person's body, you can see the insulin pump. So this is a small machine that contains a syringe that has an insulin infusion in it. And so instead of having just intermittent injections, this provides a continuous infusion of sort of small amounts of insulin. And you can see that it's attached to a line, and that line is attached to an insertion site, which again goes just under the skin. So in an artificial pancreas system, these two devices actually speak to each other through Bluetooth. So the monitor sends information to the pump, and then the pump decides, how much insulin to give. But that's achieved using something called a control algorithm, which is basically a program which contains a set of decision rules which governs how much insulin is going to be given and when, and sort of does that in response to the blood glucose readings from the monitor. And the really important point about all of this is that it's an automated process. So the patient actually doesn't have to do anything here. Apart from they have to wear the device, but aside from that, the device does everything. It makes the decisions, it does the monitoring, and it delivers the insulin. So just a little bit more about artificial pancreas systems, because as you might imagine, they can be quite complex systems, and there are several variants of them that are on the market. So they can be single hormone artificial pancreas systems, and they just deliver insulin. But there can also be dual hormone systems, and they can deliver insulin and glucagon. And so in those instances where I showed you before the insulin pump, there's 2 syringes in the pump, so one with insulin, one of glucagon, and then the system decides how much of each thing the patient should have. And I also mentioned that there was a control algorithm to govern the amount of insulin or insulin and glucagon, if that's there as well, that's actually delivered. And I won't say too much about this because it's obviously a very specialist area in itself, but I'm just going to mention 3 different types of algorithms because they came up in the review that we're going to look at more closely. So there's something called a proportional integrative derivative algorithm, or a PID algorithm. And this basically means that the device looks at the patient's blood glucose levels, and it compares that to what should be the normal range of blood glucose levels. And it also looks at the patient's history of the difference between their blood glucose and what's considered normal. And based on those data, it then comes up with a decision about what insulin to provide at any one time. There's also something called a model predictive control algorithm, and this works on the basis of having constraints put in place. So in this instance, it's constraints on the rate of insulin that can be delivered. And the last one is called fuzzy logic. And fuzzy logic means that the sort of boundaries and definitions can be made more flexible. And the sort of application of this in terms of insulin infusion is that the system would allow the clinician to sort of set the system up so that it can be more flexible and make allowances for different patients' individual needs. So that's artificial pancreas systems. So obviously with effectiveness research, we have to have a comparator. So I'll just say now a little bit about the comparator intervention. So this is a continuous subcutaneous insulin infusion pump. So in other words, if you like, it's just the pump element of the system that we just looked at. So in normal circumstances, for people with type 1 diabetes, this would be used in conjunction with a blood glucose monitor, which is a little device that's external to the body. And the way that works is that you do a finger prick with a sterile needle. The patient then puts a drop of blood onto a strip. The strip goes in the meter, and then that gives a blood glucose reading. And from that, then the patient decides what setting to put the pump on for insulin delivery. And in the review, again, there were different variants of how this pump could be used in the comparator groups. So they described it as being used alone, but for type 1 diabetes, that would normally be with the finger prick test that I just described. It could also be used with a blinded continuous glucose monitor. So the patient would wear a glucose monitor, a little bit like they did for the artificial pancreas systems, but the two devices would not actually be talking to each other. And blinded means that the patient can't see the values from the monitor, but they get transferred, say, via a mobile device to a clinician who can keep an eye on them. And the third option for the insulin pump as a comparator is that it's used as part of an unblinded sensor-augmented pump system. So that means, again, the patient has the glucose monitor there, but they can actually see the readings, and then they would take the decisions about what insulin to provide. So the main distinction in some ways between this and the artificial pancreas systems is that the artificial pancreas was, as I said, automated. This isn't automated. The devices are not integrated, they're not talking to each other, and it's up to the patient to make the decisions about how much insulin to set up for themselves on the basis of the blood glucose information. So I'll just say a little bit about the outcomes of treatment. So with type 1 diabetes, there are many possible different outcomes of treatment or things that you might measure to see if an intervention is working. These are the ones that were featured in the review. So these are the ones I'm going to focus on. So one thing is that's measured is the percentage of time that the patient spends within what's considered the normal blood glucose range. So this is sometimes called the target range. And for type 1 diabetes, the aim would normally be between 3.9 to 8 or 3.9 to 10 millimoles per litre. And the reason I've got two different ranges there is because there are different definitions of a normal range for diabetes. A related outcome to that is the percentage of time spent below the normal range. In other words, time spent in hypoglycemia, where your blood sugar is too low. So that's less than 3.9 millimoles per litre. So the idea of interventions then is that the clinician wants to maximise the time spent in the target range or the normal range, but wants to minimise the time that the patient spends below the normal range, because, as I explained before, that can lead to real problems. And in terms of the research, these outcomes can be monitored overnight or over a 24-hour period, or actually for longer periods. But in the review that we're going to look at, they just looked at overnight and 24-hour periods. And a third outcome of the review was the total daily insulin requirement. Now, this is an important one because the idea is that in a patient who is stable and has got a well-controlled blood sugar, they actually overall, obviously they will need insulin, but they will use less insulin than somebody who is less stable and their blood sugar's swinging all over the place. So that's why this is included also in the review, as it's an indication of how well the glycemic control is being achieved. So I'm now going to move on to the appraisal of the KSR evidence record, and I hope that gave you a little bit of information just about the subject area. So we always start off by just recording some basic details about the review. And this isn't exactly what it looks like on the record, but this is representing the information that you would see when you go into a KSR evidence record. So we start off with a number of studies. So for this review, there were 24 studies included in the review, and those 24 studies included 27 comparisons. And that's because there were some studies that had more than 2 treatment arms. The overall number of participants across the studies was 585. And we look at the last search date because this gives us an idea about how current the review is. So in this case, it was done on the 4th of January 2017. We also look at the review type. So this relates to what type of research question is the review trying to address. So in this case, it was an intervention review, so it was trying to address a question about treatment effectiveness. And then finally, for this little bit, we record the objective. So in this case, the objective was to assess the efficacy and safety of artificial pancreas systems in managing glycemic control in people with type 1 diabetes. And this information is usually readily available from the abstract of the paper. And if it's not there, then sometimes we have to delve into the method section or perhaps the start of the results section. but usually the details are relatively readily available. We then move on to look at the study selection criteria that the review has used. So study selection criteria are really important because they're the backbone, if you like, they're the basis for all systematic reviews. They tell you what the review is actually covering. And for this, we use the PICO or PICOS framework, which, as you may have come across, is often used for setting questions, but is also useful as a basis for describing the study selection criteria. So for this review, the P for the population was both adults and children with type 1 diabetes managed in outpatient settings. So in other words, it was patients who were relatively well. They weren't sort of the more sick patients who would be hospitalized. The intervention could be single hormone or dual hormone artificial pancreas systems. And the comparator was the conventional insulin pump therapy, as I described earlier. So the outcomes, there were 3 outcomes, again, as I mentioned before. So the percentage of time spent in the target blood glucose range, the percentage of time spent in hypoglycemia, and then the insulin requirement. And the only eligible study design was randomized controlled trials. And obviously they're the optimum design for assessing treatment effectiveness. And those trials could be a parallel group or of crossover design. And in terms of where do you find this information in the paper? Well, normally we find this in the methods section, and that's usually fairly straightforward. So we then come to the results section. And sometimes this can be a challenge for us, those of us who are writing the KSR evidence records. So for example, this paper was published as a main paper, and that was 12 pages. There was also a supplementary file, and that was another 16 pages. So out of those total of 28 pages, actually 14 of them were covering the results in some format or another. And the results, could take the form of text, a narrative, or tables, or figures and meta-analysis plots. And there were 3 main analyses and 16 subgroup analyses. So you can probably get the idea here, there's quite a large volume of information that we need to, those of us who are writing the records, our job is to condense this into a useful summary for users of KSR evidence. So I've mentioned, there's a number of analyses. So I'm going to just say a little bit more about those. So there were 3 main meta-analyses. So one was the time in target blood glucose range. That was the primary outcome for the review. And then there was time spent in hypoglycemia, and then insulin requirement. Now, for each of those main meta-analyses, there was also a series of subgroup analyses. So I'll just explain a little bit about this. So subgroup analyses can be done for different reasons. So sometimes it's to see whether there's a different effect of the intervention in different groups. Sometimes it can be to help with exploring the underlying causes of statistical heterogeneity. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. But just to explain the subgroups a little bit more now. So for example, for the first main meta-analysis, time in target range. So what the review authors did was to analyze all of the studies overall who were reporting that outcome. And they then, for the subgroup analysis, they split the trials up into the ones that recruited adults and the ones that recruited children, and they performed separate meta-analyses for those populations, and that enabled them to look at whether the estimates were any different for those meta-analyses. And other subgroups were focusing on whether single or dual hormone artificial pancreas devices were used. They also looked at the time of the intervention, whether it was overnight or whether it was over 24 hours. They looked at the type of algorithm. So if you recall, I described 3 different types of algorithms. So there were 3 subgroups. And they looked at whether remote blood glucose monitoring was used. Now, I'll just explain this a little bit. So remote monitoring means that the system can be set up to allow transmission of blood glucose values via Bluetooth to a mobile device. And that means the information can be shared in real time with other people. So for example, if it's a child that's the patient, that information could be shared with their parent, or for either adults or children. It could be shared with a clinician who could say, access it through a secure website. And the idea of this is that there's additional monitoring, there's additional support. If it's a clinician, they can, if they're worried about the blood glucose level, they can contact the patient and say, you know, I think you need to alter your settings, or, you know, what is it you're eating at the moment? Have you tried to do this, and so on. So it's, in a way, it's an additional component of the intervention that was there for some, in some trials, but not others. And finally, on the subgroup analyses, there was an additional analysis for the time in target range main outcome, which is the definition of target range, because as I mentioned before, there can be different definitions. So I'm going to move on now to just outline what the results of the review were. And the results that I'm going to discuss now are from a series of meta-analyses. And the summary statistic for all of the analyses was the pooled difference in means between artificial pancreas systems and the comparator, the insulin pump. And all meta-analyses were random effects models with weighting by the inverse of the variance. So what did they find for time in target range? Well, they found that on average, the time in target range was around 12.5% higher for people who were attached to the artificial pancreas systems compared with the conventional pump. And you can see from the 95% confidence interval that, well, 12.5% was the average, but it could have been as low as 9%, or it could have been as high as 16%. But that estimate doesn't include the point of no effect. You know, therefore, this indicates a difference, a between group difference in favour of the artificial pancreas systems. But that's the relative effect. It's often useful to look at the absolute effects as well. So we can do that by looking at the weighted mean for the conventional pump therapy group. So that's the comparator group. So people in the comparator group were on average spending around 58% of their time within the target range. But the artificial pancreas system was another 12.5% on top of that time spent in a good range, a healthy blood glucose range. So I mentioned lots of subgroup analyses, and in this instance, results across most of the subgroup analyses suggested a between group difference in favour of the artificial pancreas system. So in other words, they were agreeing with the main analysis, but there was an exception, and the exception was systems based on the proportional integrative derivative algorithms for the artificial pancreas. And it was found that where you had a comparison between those sorts of artificial pancreas and the comparator, actually no between group difference was apparent. So I'm going to move on now to the second main outcome, which was the time in hypoglycemia. So we can perhaps look at the comparator first. So the weighted mean in the comparator group was 4.88%. So this means that on average, the people receiving the comparator intervention spent nearly 5% of their time in hypoglycemia. So their blood sugar was too low at that point. The artificial pancreas resulted in, on average, 2.45% of time less than that in hypoglycemia. And the 95% confidence interval indicates that it could have been as much as 3.8% less time in hypoglycemia, or around 1%. So the minor signs are there. It means that the time in hypoglycemia was lower for the people in the artificial pancreas systems. And again, the estimate doesn't include a point of no effect. So it indicates a between group difference in favour of the artificial pancreas systems for the overall analysis. And again, most of the subgroup analyses were in agreement with this pretty much. Again, there were some exceptions. So the estimates that were for children, and again for the PID algorithm, and where remote monitoring wasn't used, suggested there were no differences between artificial pancreas systems and the conventional pump. And for the third outcome, we come to the insulin requirement. So again, it might be helpful to look at the comparator first. So the weighted mean for the conventional pump therapy group was 1 insulin unit per kilogram per hour. And in point of fact, with this in the overall analysis, no between group difference was seen. And the subgroup analyses were also in line with that, again, apart from a couple of exceptions. And the subgroup analyses found that there was an increased insulin requirement for artificial pancreas systems, so in fact, a less favourable finding for artificial pancreas systems for children, and also for overnight timing of the intervention. But if you look at the average values, so for children on average, 0.19 of a unit, and for overnight timing, 0.09. So those are quite small differences. And although the estimates indicate statistical significance, it might be that the clinical significance also needs to be examined. And I'm not a clinician with an expertise in diabetes particularly, so I wouldn't want to call judgment on that. But what I just want to draw attention to is there can be a distinction between statistical significance and clinical significance. And sometimes it's worthwhile just thinking about that when looking at results from any research, actually. So this slide, I don't want you to read the small print because you'll get a headache if you try and do that. But this is just to show you roughly what the results would look like on the KSR evidence record. So I presented it in bullet points before, just for clarity on the slides, but we don't do that on the KSR evidence record. Obviously, we provide a narrative. We want to provide some context and to make it a useful summary for KSR evidence users. So this is a little bit like what it would look like on the record. So I'm now going to move on to talk about the assessing risk of bias in the review. And first of all, I'm just going to say just a little bit about the tool that we use, the ROBIS tool. So ROBIS stands for Risk of Bias in Systematic Reviews. And it was developed by a distinguished group of researchers and has gone on to be quite widely used. It takes a domain-based approach. So you can see from the slide there are 4 domains. And I'm going to say more about them as I go on. But in that sense, it's similar to other tools, other risk of bias tools. So the Cochrane risk of bias tool, the original and the more up-to-date one, Robin's Eye, the QuadAS tools, QuadAS 2, and ProBAST. So these all share this sort of domain-based approach. And again, another slide where there's a lot of small print, but the main thing I want to put across here is that for each main domain, there are also a series of subdomains. And again, I'm going to explain more about these as I go along. So please don't worry about reading that. But sometimes the subdomains are called signaling questions because each one is a question that's answered by the person doing the appraisal. And one of the advantages on having a domain-based approach like this is that the appraisal is based on empirically demonstrated sources of bias. So it's things that really have an impact on the review findings, rather than having things that are just really how well the reviewers reported certain things. This goes into more, well, what was it they actually did and how did that impact on risk of bias? So now I'm going to move on to the ROBIS appraisal for the review. So we start off with domain 1, which is on study eligibility criteria. So the questions within this domain are trying to dig down and find out whether the objectives and the study selection criteria were pre-specified, and also were they did they make sense? Did they hang together? Were they appropriate? And were they actually followed throughout the review? Or did the reviewers do something to diverge from the original plan? So the first question, so did the review adhere to predefined objectives and eligibility criteria? Well, in this instance, yes, it did. So I can put a yes there. And the reason I'm saying that was because this review was, the protocol for this review was registered on the Prospero register. So that meant it was very easy for me to go to the Prospero, download that record, and then compare that against the paper. And I could easily see from that that the review authors had followed their pre-specified objectives and study eligibility criteria. So next we look at whether the eligibility criteria were appropriate for the review question. So obviously the two things should be quite closely related. And again, the answer was yes. They related properly to the review question and there weren't any problems there. For the third question, we look at whether the eligibility criteria were unambiguous. So ideally, they should be replicable. They should be clear enough to be replicable. And in this instance, they were. They were clearly expressed, and that was fine. So the fourth and fifth questions look at whether there were any restrictions on study eligibility criteria and whether or not these were appropriate. So 1.4, it looks at restrictions based on study characteristics. So this is things like the date of publication or the sample size, study quality, or outcomes. Now there was a restriction in terms of outcomes because the review only focused on those three outcomes, the ones I've already outlined. But actually, that seemed to be fair enough, given the focus of the review and the subject area, excuse me. And so for that, I put probably yes rather than a yes. They could have looked at additional outcomes, but the ones that they covered probably did the job okay. So the final question looks at whether the restrictions in eligibility criteria based on sources of information were appropriate. So this is things like publication status, language, and availability of data. Now this one, there were some issues here because the review authors actually excluded studies that weren't published in English. And on scrutiny of their list of excluded studies, it became apparent that they'd excluded quite a few studies based on the fact that they were conference abstracts. So both of those things are potentially a problem because it means that relevant studies could have been missed from the review. So for this domain, we put a probably no there. So it means probably no, probably not appropriate as an eligibility restriction. And actually that's quite a frequent problem in reviews. We find with KSR evidence that if they're going to run into a problem in this domain, it's often 1.5 and excluding non-English language papers, for example. So with a domain-based approach, we put in ratings, such as I've done here, but we also need to put in our rationale for those ratings in order to be transparent about why we've come to the judgments that we have. So you'll forgive me for pre-preparing the text and not typing it all in front of you, but the text there that I've just included now is just what I've just outlined to you in going through the list. So for domain 1, our overall verdict for the domain was that it's high risk of bias because of those issues with excluding non-English language studies and excluding conference abstracts. So we can go on now to domain 2. So domain 2 asks questions about the quality of the search and the study selection process. So the first question asks, did the search include an appropriate range of databases to retrieve published and unpublished reports? So this review included Medline, Embase, and the Cochrane Central Register of Controlled Trials. So here we put probably yes, that's quite a good range of databases. They could have included some other things perhaps. There are possibly specialised sources that focus on diabetes research and so on. But on the whole, that was a reasonable coverage in terms of databases. So the second question is about were methods additional to database searching used to identify relevant reports? So this can be an important thing for trying to locate the grey literature or unpublished studies, for example. So what the review authors did here was that they searched Google Scholar and they reviewed the first 200 hits. So that's okay, that can come up with some grey literature, can be a useful thing to do. Just to clarify, it's not a useful thing to do by itself with a systematic review, but if it's used in combination with databases, then it can be useful. So again, we put probably yes rather than a yes, because they could have actually done other things. So they could have looked at ongoing trial registers. You know, they could have looked at certain websites, for example, but we reckon it was probably okay on the whole. So for the third question looks at the search strings. So these are the search terms that are used for each database and the way that they are put together and combined and structured. Now, these were provided in detail, in fact, in the supplemental file. So we were able to really scrutinize these. And we felt, as I've already indicated, in fact, we felt that these were quite good. They were detailed. The authors had included relevant synonyms and indexing terms. We did have a slight query with the limit they put for the study selection, study design term, that we felt that could have been a little bit better. But overall, we felt that, you know, they'd done a reasonable job here. So that's why we put probably yes. So 2.4 asks about restrictions based on date, publication format, or language. And we could see from the search strings that they didn't apply those types of restrictions. So we put yes here, that was okay. And just to be clear, we did penalise for the domain 1 because they'd excluded the non-English language studies at the study selection stage. They hadn't excluded them at the search stage. So we make differentiation between those two things. And then for the last question for this domain, were efforts made to minimise error in selection of studies? So here we're looking at the study selection process, and the reviewers indicated that they'd involved 2 independent reviewers working to select studies. Those reviewers then got together to compare agreements and reached agreement through discussion and consensus. And that's considered as good practice. So again, we would put a yes for that. And once again, obviously I include my comments to explain why I've come to these decisions. And this domain overall was at low risk of bias. And obviously the reviewers have done a good job here. But just to give you more of a flavour for when things possibly can go wrong, 2.1, we often mark that down, say if a review has only searched a single database. So we do see a number of reviews where they say, you know, we searched one database, it was PubMed. You know, we generally consider that there needs to be several databases searched in order to have an adequate coverage of the literature for systematic review purposes. So that's domain 2. So domain 3, this is to do with how the details from individual studies are represented in the review and the level of detail and so on, and also how they've been critically appraised, how the study's been critically appraised within the review. So again, we have a series of questions. So we start with, were efforts made to minimise error in data collection? So this is a process question. For this, the review authors indicated that 2 reviewers had independently extracted data. They then got together to compare agreement, and then they'd resolved any discrepancies through discussion. So that's good practice. So we're happy with that. The next question considers, was sufficient study characteristics sort of presented for readers to be able to interpret the results? And in fact, in this review, there was actually a lot of detail. There was a lot of detail about studies in tables and in the narrative text. And we could see data in the meta-analysis forest plots as well. So again, that was all fine. So moving on, were all relevant study results collected for use in the synthesis? Yes, we could see that they were. We could tell from the forest plots that they were. So that was, again, that was fine, and it was very clear. It then goes on to ask about methodological assessment. So first of all, the question is about the tool that's used. So was an appropriate tool used to measure the risk of bias in the included studies? So in this review, they used the original Cochrane risk of bias tool, which is appropriate for assessing the quality of randomized controlled trials. It's not the most up-to-date version because there hasn't been another version released since then, but it's still appropriate. So we said, yes, that was okay. And lastly, were efforts made to minimize error in the risk of bias assessment? Now for this, we put a probably yes, because the review authors were not completely explicit about what they did. However, they sort of mentioned risk of bias assessment in the same breath as data extraction. And from that, it seemed reasonable to assume that they would have followed the same process. So they would have had 2 independent reviewers, they would have had decisions being resolved by consensus. And we felt that that was okay. And again, we include our comments, and this domain overall was at low risk of bias. So again, this was a good example, but where we see problems, we do see a number of reviews where they purport to be systematic, but actually they don't include any assessment of the methodological assessment of papers. So obviously, if that was to happen, this would put this domain at high risk of bias, but we're all right for this review. So moving on to the last domain, then domain 4. So this focuses on methods of data synthesis. So if it's a meta-analysis, then it looks at the meta-analysis, but this can also be used where systematic reviews don't include a meta-analysis. So the first question then is whether the synthesis included all of the studies that it should. So the synthesis should be should be based on all eligible studies. So in this instance, yes, it was. We could tell from the meta-analysis forest plots. Were all predefined analyses reported or departures explained? Now, again, it was really useful to have the Prospero record because I could go back and see what they'd said they were going to do at the outset, and I could tell that, yes, they basically followed their plan. So again, that was all fine. Was the synthesis appropriate given the degree of similarity in the research questions, study designs and outcomes across the included studies? Generally speaking, yes, it was. They did anticipate a certain amount of clinical heterogeneity, and that's probably to be expected in this sort of subject area. They pre-planned their subgroup analyses. They did have a couple of post hoc subgroup analyses, but that's not uncommon. So overall, yes, it was probably an appropriate synthesis approach. Well, obviously, statistical heterogeneity is quite a big thing in meta-analyses and sort of shouldn't be ignored. So question 4.4 asks, was between study variation minimal or addressed in the synthesis? It wasn't minimal. So for 2 of the main meta-analyses, they showed high levels of statistical heterogeneity. Most of their subgroup analyses were pre-planned. So they did explore, I think, as much as possible as they could through subgroup analyses. The subgroup analyses didn't always resolve the heterogeneity, but the review authors probably couldn't have done a great deal more to try and explore it. They could have looked at outlying studies. I mean, there were some analyses that looked like there were sort of outliers. They could have perhaps explored that. There could have been an option not to pool, but then you lose the usefulness of having an overall estimate. So we felt that overall, the strategy that they used was probably okay. So 4.5 asks, were the findings robust? So this is looking at whether sensitivity analysis of funnel plots have been included and whether or not those analyses would show robust results. And in this instance, those were included, and they did indicate robustness as far as they went. And lastly, were biases in primary studies minimal or addressed in the synthesis? Now, in fact, there was one planned sensitivity analysis that the real review authors didn't do, and that was based on study quality. And the reason they didn't do it was because all of the studies were actually at high risk of bias. So none of them had blinded patients or personnel, and the risk of bias was high or unclear for blinding outcome assessors. So there was a problem with blinding. So actually most of the studies in the review were at high risk of bias. So we felt, well, they'd considered it, you know, they would have explored it if there'd been something to explore. And so the approach they used, probably all right. Again, we include our comment, and this domain was at low risk of bias. And so that's the end of our 4 domains. Just to say, if there's problems within this domain, it is often to do with heterogeneity. So having completed the questions on the 4 separate domains, we considered them overall to come up with an overall risk of bias for the review. And again, there's a few questions to answer. So did the interpretation findings address all of the concerns that we found? Well, it didn't in this instance. So what we're looking for here is not just for the review authors to acknowledge that, you know, there may have been a limitation to their review, but to perhaps include some extra explorations or analyses to try and explore the impact. So what would have been the impact of excluding the non-English language studies? You know, what was the likely impact of excluding the conference abstracts? And they didn't go into that. They did consider the reviews, the studies in relation to the reviews question. That was really okay. They did tend to emphasize statistical significance, although they also obviously reported the estimation with confidence intervals. So that in itself was helpful. Again, we include comments, but the overall risk of bias for the review is high risk. And that's because of those problems with excluding non-English language studies and excluding conference abstracts, because relevant material may have been omitted. And actually missing relevant material is a sort of a systematic review sin. You don't want to miss relevant material. So the last bit I come to then is the bottom line. So just to say, this is actually a part of the KSR evidence record. And in fact, when Will showed you back at the start, showed you some of the first view you get of the record, the first view you get, you see the bibliographic details of the review, you see the bottom line, and you see the overall risk of bias rating for the review. So what were the main messages from the review? Well, the artificial pancreas systems were associated with better outcomes versus the comparator for time in target range and time spent in hypoglycemia. But for both outcomes, the difference between treatments might be less when the proportional integrative derivative algorithms were used for the artificial pancreas systems. So there's something about those algorithms that might mean that it brings the performance of those systems closer to the comparator. And for the outcome of time in hypoglycemia, the differences between treatments may be less apparent for children and when remote monitoring isn't used. So remember, I said the remote monitoring does add something to the intervention. And insulin requirement may be higher in children or during overnight treatment on artificial pancreas systems. So as part of the bottom line, we also include a comment about quality. So we'd say, although this was a generally well-conducted systematic review, unfortunately, it was let down by omission of non-English language papers and conference abstracts. That means that relevant material could have been missed. And this is more or less what the bottom line looks like on the KSR evidence record. So we don't have little balloons, as much fun as that might be, but we present it as a narrative. So the final steps then for us when we're writing an appraisal is that once we finished writing, we submit the appraisal to our internal system, and it's submitted for checking and copy editing. And today's appraisal will be available shortly after the end of the session. So we've done those bits. Those are the references I've used, and that's the end of my presentation. And thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to try and answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue, for that session on writing a critical appraisal. Let me just turn on my video here. Hello, everyone. Now, as Sue mentioned, the record has now been submitted for further checks and edits, and it will actually be published today after today's session. Now, just very quickly, because I am aware of time here, requesting fast tracks on KSR Evidence, like I showed you how to do that earlier on, means that critical appraisals that are relevant not only to our little, made up guideline here, but to any guideline, any piece of work that you undertake can be completed at a fraction of the cost and much more quickly and efficiently by KSR Evidence when compared to writing the critical appraisal ourselves. Now, KSR Evidence is available on a subscription basis with costs dependent on the size and the type of the organization. If you want to know more about our subscription models, please do contact us. And finally, as participants in this webinar, you will all receive a free trial code after the webinar has ended. So you can try out KSR Evidence, see if it suits your needs. You can have a play around with the advanced search. And of course, most importantly, you can access the appraisal that we have written in this session. And like I said, it will be made available today. So do a search for that and see how it looks on KSR Evidence when it has been published. Now, we do have a couple of questions that have been submitted by the audience, so thank you very much for doing that. As a reminder, if you have a question that you have not yet submitted, please enter it in the Q&A and we will get through as many as time allows. Please, before I start with the questions, allow me to introduce you to one of our information specialists here at KSR Evidence, which is Lisa Sturck. She has kindly joined us to answer any questions you might have regarding our advanced search interface. So please make use of that, the fact that she is here with us. Thank you, Lisa, for joining us.
No problem, thank you.
Okay, so I will pose the first question that we have here to Sue, which says, you have penalized the review for excluding studies only available as conference abstracts, but there's only a limited amount of information available from abstracts. So why would this exclusion matter?
Well, I mean, that is a good point. There is limited information available from conference abstracts. But there's probably a couple of things to say there. So one is that although artificial pancreas systems, they're not a new intervention, but there are new versions of them coming out all the time. So sometimes if there's something new or novel, the only evidence available is as conference abstracts. So to not include them, you might be sort of missing some relevant material there. And the other thing is that conference abstracts are, I think, not quite what they used to be in some respects. So at one time, you would maybe get a really tiny amount of information, but now they're often a little bit more detailed. So you can have sort of tabulated data and figures shown. And obviously, there are also options to contact authors to see if they can give you more information on, say, baseline characteristics or methodological details and so on. So generally speaking, I mean, it can be quite context dependent. So if it's a very established intervention where nothing new much is going on, then it might not matter quite so much. But generally speaking, we would probably recommend to include conference abstracts in the review.
Okay, thank you very much, Sue. Then the next question also for you. High levels of statistical heterogeneity persisted within the subgroup analyses. Why was this not penalized in the ROBIS evaluation?
Well, in some respects, the reviewers had really done as much as they could to explore the sources of heterogeneity. And sort of it's not the reviewer's fault that heterogeneity is there. It's a characteristic of the body of evidence. And as I sort of alluded to in the presentation, they perhaps could have done a little bit more, but they'd really been pretty thorough. And other than really resorting to a systematic review and meta-analysis based on individual patient data, there probably wasn't a lot more that they could have done. So it sort of would have felt a bit unfair to penalise them, really, when they had gone to quite a lot of effort, and their analysis was detailed.
Thank you. There's only one more question right now to go. So again, if you have any questions, of course, you can always contact us after the webinar has ended. We are available on Twitter. You can see the contact details on the slide here. But please let us know, because now is your chance to ask us this question live. So finally, I think, Sue, this is for you again, but Lisa, feel free to weigh in. What is the likely impact of excluding studies published in languages other than English?
Well, again, that can be very context dependent, so it will matter much more for some reviews than for others. We have done some reviewing in KSR ourselves on this sort of subject area, and we're aware that there is the potential for literature published in languages other than English, so particularly in other European languages. So for that reason, we would tend to advocate including non-English language papers in the review.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, there are no other questions. So Lisa, you are here, but there are no questions for you. So thank you very much for joining. Again, just as a reminder, I know I've said it before, you can always contact us after the webinar has ended. You can contact us on email, Twitter, LinkedIn, all of these channels. We are available to answer any question you might have. But if there's nothing else forthcoming, then the only thing that rests me to do is to thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. Susan, thank you for sharing your insight and your expertise. Lisa, thank you for joining us for the Q&A, even though you were not needed. Now, if you have any questions or would like to contact us directly, you can use the contact details on the slide here, or you can just reach out to us via Twitter or LinkedIn. Now, finally, we would really appreciate it if you could take just a minute to fill out the post-webinar survey, which will show once you exit this webinar. And now all that rests me to say is thank you for your time. Have a great rest of World Evidence-Based Healthcare Day. Enjoy the rest of the week. I know that there are quite a few very interesting events going on, so please enjoy. And yeah, have a wonderful rest of your day, and goodbye.